If you dare to explore the darkest mysteries, subscribe now to Whispers in the Dark. Activate notifications and be prepared to hear whispers that may haunt you even in the silence of the night. Real stories, mysterious events, and spine-chilling tales. But beware, fear will always be your companion here. Click the subscribe button before it's too late. Frozen Lake and the Silent SUV. I've always loved winter. There's something about the stillness it brings, the way the world feels quieter under a thick blanket of snow. A few weeks ago, I decided to visit a lake from my childhood, a small, frozen expanse surrounded by dense pine trees, tucked away from any main roads. I hadn't been there in years, but I remembered it vividly as a place where my family used to skate and roast marshmallows over a fire. It was supposed to be a peaceful trip, just me, my thermos of hot coffee, and my old Subaru, reliving simpler days. I should have turned around the moment I saw how quickly the weather was turning, but I didn't. Stubbornness has always been my downfall. The road to the lake was more treacherous than I expected. The snowstorm started out gentle, but by the time I reached the clearing where the lake was, it was coming down hard, turning the world into a blur of white. My tires crunched over the unplowed road as I parked near the tree line. The place was completely empty, which didn't surprise me, given the weather. I left the engine running for warmth and stepped out to take in the view, pulling my scarf tight against the wind. That's when I noticed the SUV. It was parked maybe 50 yards away, half buried in snow, its windshield frosted over like it had been there for days. Something about it immediately put me on edge. There were no footprints, no sign anyone had come or gone, just the silent, abandoned vehicle staring at the lake. At first, I told myself it wasn't that strange. Maybe someone had parked it there before the storm and left with a friend or walked back to town. But as I stood there, the unease crept in. The SUV was tilted slightly, its back wheel half sunken into the snowbank, like it had slid there in a rush. The passenger side door was ajar, just enough to let in the wind, which made it creak faintly as it swayed. I couldn't stop staring at it. It felt wrong. The longer I stood there, the more my gut screamed at me to leave, but I didn't. Instead, I approached it, crunching over the snow. My boots left the only prints on the otherwise untouched surface. When I got closer, I could see that the windows were frosted over on the inside too, which struck me as odd. I peeked through the driver's side, wiping away some of the ice with my sleeve, and saw nothing. The seats were empty. There were no bags, no signs that anyone had been there recently. Just an open glove box with some papers scattered on the passenger seat. That's when the wind picked up hard, and I swore I heard something. A low, muffled thump from inside the car, like someone knocking softly from the trunk. I stumbled back, heart racing, staring at that locked rear door, my breath visible in the freezing air. It was probably just the wind, I told myself. Probably. I practically ran back to my car, the cold air biting at my face as I fumbled to open the driver's door. Once inside, I locked the doors and cranked the heat, gripping the steering wheel as if that could steady my nerves. I told myself I was overreacting, that the sound was just a branch or the snow settling. Still, I couldn't stop glancing at the SUV. It just sat there, motionless, barely visible through the swirling snow. The storm was picking up, turning the world outside into a chaotic blur of white and gray. My phone had no signal, which wasn't surprising out here, but it added another layer of unease. I thought about leaving, but the road had gotten so bad I wasn't sure I'd make it back to the highway. I decided to wait it out, hoping the storm would pass. Minutes dragged into what felt like hours. The snow piled higher, and visibility dropped to almost nothing. My car was warm, but it didn't feel safe anymore. Every so often, I'd hear faint noises, cracks, groans, maybe the wind, but my mind kept circling back to that SUV. Why was it there? Who had left it, and where had they gone? Then, the sound came again. A dull, rhythmic thumping. This time, it wasn't muffled. It was outside, near my car. My breath caught in my throat as I stared through the fogged-up windshield. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it. Something, or someone, was out there. I turned off the radio and sat in total silence, straining to hear over the howling wind. The thumping came again, louder this time, like someone, or something, was circling my car. My heart was hammering, and I gripped my phone, useless as it was, like it could somehow protect me. Slowly, I reached over to the passenger side window and wiped away the condensation. For a second, I thought I saw movement, a shadow or figure just beyond the glow of my headlights. But when I blinked and looked again, it was gone. My brain was scrambling for explanations, clinging to logic. It's the storm. It's just the storm. But then the sound came again, closer now, deliberate. It wasn't the erratic noise of branches or snow falling. It was methodical, like footsteps crunching through the snow. I couldn't stay there. I needed to leave, storm or no storm. I jammed the key into the ignition, but as I reached for the gear shift, my headlights flickered. The world outside the car went black, and for a brief, suffocating moment, I was completely blind. When the lights came back on, I swear I saw them, two figures, standing still as statues just behind the SUV. Their faces were turned toward me, but they were too far to make out. My blood ran cold. I couldn't explain it, but I knew they were watching me. My first instinct was to reverse, but the snow was so deep I could feel the tires struggling for traction. I hit the gas, but the wheels spun uselessly, kicking up powder. My pulse was pounding in my ears as I glanced back at the SUV. The figures were gone. I scanned the storm through the rearview mirror, desperate to see where they had gone, but the snow swallowed everything. My breath fogged up the glass as I leaned forward, trying to see through the windshield. That's when something slammed against the back of my car. Hard. The whole vehicle jolted, and I let out a scream before clapping my hand over my mouth. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. I twisted in my seat and stared out the back window. There was nothing there. Just swirling snow and darkness. My heart felt like it was going to burst as I shifted into drive and tried again to move forward. This time, the car lurched ahead a few feet before getting stuck again. I was panicking now, the fear clawing at my chest like an animal. Another sound, closer this time, near the passenger side. A low scraping, like something dragging across the metal. My fingers trembled as I reached for the window button, cracking it just enough to hear the storm. And in the chaos of wind and snow, I swear I heard a voice. Faint. Calling my name. Hearing my name stopped my heart. It wasn't just a random voice, it was mine. The same tone, the same inflection, like an echo pulled straight from my own throat. I slammed the window shut, my hands shaking so badly I could barely press the button. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was the wind twisting around the car, or the stress playing tricks on me. That's what I told myself, anyway. But deep down, I knew better. There was no one else out here, and no reason for anyone to know my name. I sat there, paralyzed, my breath shallow and fast, fogging up the inside of the windshield again. I didn't even notice how dark it had gotten until I glanced at the clock. Only 4:30 p.m., but the storm made it feel like midnight. Then the thumping returned. This time, it came from the roof. A single, heavy impact, followed by 3 deliberate knocks. Boom, boom, boom. My entire body locked up as I stared at the ceiling, my mind screaming at me to move, to do something, anything. But I couldn't. I felt frozen, like the cold outside had seeped into my veins. The knocks stopped, and for a moment, there was nothing but the howl of the storm outside. My chest felt tight, like I couldn't catch my breath. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white, my ears straining for any sound. Then came a slow, deliberate scraping across the roof, like nails or metal dragging over the frozen surface. It moved from the back of the car toward the windshield, stopping just above where I sat. I didn't dare look up. Every instinct told me to keep my eyes forward, to not acknowledge whatever was there. But my curiosity, stupid, reckless curiosity, got the better of me. I tilted my head just enough to see the edge of the windshield, and I swear I saw fingers. Blackened, skeletal fingers curling down over the glass before they slipped out of sight. That was it. I threw the car into reverse, slamming the gas. The tires spun for a second before catching, and the car lurched backward. I didn't care about the SUV or the storm anymore. I just needed to get out of there. The headlights illuminated the snow-covered path as I reversed toward the main road. But just as I felt a sliver of hope, something darted in front of the car, faster than I could process. A tall, shadowy figure, almost human but wrong, its movements jerky and unnatural. I screamed, slamming the brakes, but the car skidded on the ice and spun sideways. When it stopped, the figure was gone. I sat there, gripping the wheel, my breath coming in shallow gasps, convinced that if I stepped out of the car, I wouldn't make it back alive. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, my body trembling as the storm raged around me. The headlights cut through the swirling snow, but they didn't reach far. Every shadow looked like it was moving, shifting, waiting. I gripped the gear shift, forcing myself to think rationally. If I could just get to the main road, I'd be fine. I had to believe that. I turned the wheel, trying to get the car back on track, but the tires were sinking deeper into the snow. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw them again. The figures. Not just two this time. There were more. 5, maybe 6, standing in the distance, perfectly still, barely visible through the storm. They weren't watching the car anymore. They were walking, slow and deliberate, toward me. I don't remember much after that. Somehow, I got the car moving again, jerking forward through the snow, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the wheel. The headlights flickered, and I felt the cold seep in, like the storm itself was inside the car. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The thought of seeing them behind me was too much. Eventually, I reached the main road, the storm easing as quickly as it had started. When I got back to town, I pulled into a gas station and just sat there, staring at the steering wheel, trying to convince myself it was over. But I can still hear it sometimes, when it's quiet. That thumping sound. And I haven't been back to that lake since. I don't think I ever will. The creepy snow day. It was one of those heavy snow days in late January, the kind where the world feels muffled under a thick white blanket. I was 16, living in a quiet suburban neighborhood where nothing ever really happened. My dad had been bugging me to earn my keep, so I started shoveling driveways for neighbors to make some extra cash. Most of the people on our block were friendly retirees who tipped well, so I didn't mind the cold. That day, I bundled up in my thickest coat and grabbed my shovel, ready to knock out a few driveways before the snow got too deep. The air was crisp, and the streets were oddly still, like the world was holding its breath. The last house on my route was new. It had been empty for months before a couple moved in just a few weeks prior. Their property was a little rundown compared to the others on the block. The fence sagged, and the paint was peeling from the shutters. I hadn't seen them around much, but rumors floated about them being a little off. I chalked it up to neighbors being nosy. The couple had this weird vibe, though. They never waved back if you said hi, and their curtains were always drawn, even on sunny days. Still, a job was a job, so I clomped up their icy driveway and started shoveling. That's when I felt it. The unmistakable sensation of being watched. I paused for a second, resting the shovel against my knee, and glanced around. The street was empty, just the usual rows of houses dusted with snow. But then I saw it. Movement behind one of the upstairs windows. The curtain shifted slightly, and a pale face appeared for a split second before vanishing. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe they were just checking to see who was out there. Still, my heart picked up speed as I returned to shoveling. The scrape of metal against concrete sounded deafening in the eerie silence. A few minutes later, as I was finishing the driveway, I heard the faint creak of the front door opening. I looked up and saw the couple for the first time. The man was tall and gaunt, his skin almost translucent in the pale winter light. The woman stood slightly behind him, her eyes dark and sunken, like she hadn't slept in weeks. Neither of them said a word. They just stood there, staring at me. My stomach churned, but I forced a smile and waved. "All done," I said, my voice sounding oddly loud. The man tilted his head, like a dog trying to understand something, then slowly raised a Polaroid camera and snapped a photo of me. I froze, unsure whether to laugh it off or run. I forced myself to chuckle nervously. Do you need me to clear the back too?" I asked, hoping to break the tension. Neither of them answered. The woman shifted slightly, her gaze fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. The man lowered the camera, examined the photo for a moment, and then slid it into his coat pocket without saying a word. I decided I didn't need their money that badly. "Okay, well, have a good day," I mumbled, backing toward the street. They just stood there, motionless, as I retreated. By the time I got home, my nerves were shot. I told my dad about the couple, expecting him to brush it off, but he looked genuinely concerned. "That's weird," he said. "They don't seem like the kind of people who'd even need their driveway shoveled." When I asked what he meant, he hesitated. "I don't know. Just something about them. Like, they're not planning to stay long." His words stuck with me, adding a new layer of unease to what had already been a strange encounter. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the way they had stared at me, or the sound of that camera click. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing on my nightstand. It was a text from my neighbor, Mrs. Lindley, who lived right across the street from the couple. "Did you see anything strange last night? They had their lights on all night, and there was some kind of banging noise around 2 a.m. I hadn't heard anything, but her message sent a chill down my spine. I replied with a quick no, just weird vibes yesterday, but her text lingered in my mind all morning. Something about that house didn't sit right with me. That afternoon, as the snow started to melt, I decided to take a walk around the block to clear my head. Curiosity got the better of me, and I found myself wandering past their house again. The driveway was untouched, despite the melting snow. The place looked just as it had the day before, silent, curtains drawn tight. As I walked by, I couldn't help but glance at the upstairs window where I'd seen the face. To my shock, there was something there, a Polaroid photo taped to the inside of the glass. Even from the sidewalk, I could tell it was a picture of me. My stomach dropped, and I felt rooted to the spot. The photo was unmistakable. My red coat, my snow-covered boots, the awkward way I'd been standing in their driveway. Every instinct screamed at me to keep walking, but my curiosity had its claws in me. I reached for my phone and snapped a quick picture of the window, my hands shaking as I tried to zoom in. That's when I noticed the curtain shift again. This time, it didn't close completely. The man was standing there, partially obscured, watching me. I bolted. I didn't care how it looked. I sprinted down the street, my breath clouding in the freezing air. When I got home, I locked the door behind me and collapsed onto the couch, my heart hammering. I pulled up the photo I'd taken of their window, hoping to convince myself I'd imagined it. But the picture was clear as day. my face staring back at me from their upstairs window. I debated calling the police, but what could I say? Hi, my creepy neighbors took my picture and taped it to their window. It sounded insane. Instead, I decided to stay inside for the rest of the day and avoid that house at all costs. That night, I tried to distract myself with homework and movies, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every creak of the house made me jump, and I kept glancing out the window, half expecting to see the couple standing in the street. Around midnight, I finally forced myself to go to bed. I was exhausted but too on edge to sleep. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, until I heard it, a faint tapping sound. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but it came again. Tap, tap, tap. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The sound was coming from my bedroom window. Slowly, I turned my head toward it. The curtains were drawn, but I could see the faint outline of someone standing on the other side of the glass. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. I wanted to scream, but the sound wouldn't come out. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I reached for my phone and turned on the flashlight. In the beam of light, I saw it, a Polaroid photo pressed against the glass, held by a pale, trembling hand. It was another picture of me, this time taken from outside my house. I scrambled out of bed, heart racing, and grabbed the nearest object I could find, a desk lamp. The tapping stopped as soon as I moved, and by the time I reached the window and yanked the curtain aside, there was no one there. All that remained was the Polaroid, taped to the glass from the outside. My face stared back at me, wide-eyed and terrified, lit up by the beam of my phone's flashlight. I ripped it off and stumbled backward, trying to catch my breath. My mind was a mess of panic and questions. How long had they been there? I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. At dawn, I showed the Polaroid to my dad. He took one look at it and went pale. "We're calling the police," he said firmly, grabbing his phone. When the officers arrived, they took my statement and checked the property, but there were no signs of anyone. The snow around my window had been disturbed, but the tracks led nowhere. They just stopped abruptly, like whoever had been there vanished into thin air. The officers assured me they'd patrol the neighborhood, but I could tell they didn't take it seriously. "Probably some prank," one of them muttered as they left. Over the next few days, I tried to move on, but the unease lingered. I avoided walking past the couple's house and spent most of my time indoors. The Polaroid was still in my desk drawer, though I hated looking at it. Every time I thought about throwing it away, something stopped me, like I might need it as proof if things escalated. Then, just when I thought things were calming down, I spotted something strange while taking out the trash one evening. At the edge of our yard, near the tree line, was another Polaroid. It was half buried in the snow, as if someone had dropped it. My heart sank as I picked it up and brushed it off. It was a picture of our house, taken from a distance. The shot was slightly blurry, but it was unmistakable. My bedroom window was in the frame, and the curtains were open just enough to show me sitting on my bed. I hadn't seen anyone outside that night, let alone close enough to take this. My hands started trembling again. They were still watching me. That was the last straw. I marched inside and showed the new photo to my dad. This time, he didn't hesitate. He called the police again. 2 officers arrived within 20 minutes and took the photo as evidence. They promised to check in on the couple at the suspicious house, but their reassurances didn't do much to calm me. I stayed up late that night, pacing and checking the locks, feeling like a prisoner in my own home. I kept replaying everything in my head. The stairs, the photos, the tapping. It didn't add up, but I knew one thing. I wasn't imagining this. The next morning, I saw the patrol car parked near the couple's house and decided to walk by, just to see if anything had changed. To my shock, the driveway was empty, and the house looked abandoned. No curtains. No signs of life. Even the snow on their porch was untouched, like no one had been there for days. I stopped in front of Mrs. Lindley's house, and she stepped outside before I could knock. "They're gone," she said in a hushed voice. "The police came by last night, but when they knocked, the house was empty. Completely empty." Her words sent a shiver down my spine. "What do you mean, empty?" I asked. Mrs. Lindley frowned, clutching her coat against the cold. "I mean there was no furniture, no boxes, nothing. It's like they never moved in." I couldn't believe it. I'd seen them. I'd shoveled their driveway. I'd spoken to them, or at least tried to. My head spun as I tried to piece it together. The police had left the scene shortly after, but Mrs. Lindley said one of the officers looked disturbed as he walked back to the car. "He didn't say much, just told me to keep an eye out," she whispered. For weeks, I avoided the house. Every time I passed it, I felt an unexplainable dread. The snow eventually melted, and new people moved in during the spring. They seemed normal enough, but I never stopped wondering about the couple. Who were they? Why did they take those photos? Sometimes, late at night, I think about that tapping on my window, and I wonder if they're still out there, watching someone else. The Polaroid of my face is still in my drawer. I can't bring myself to throw it away, as if it's the only proof that any of it really happened. Deadly descent on the slopes. I've been skiing my whole life. I'm not some overconfident amateur who thinks they can handle anything. I know my limits. But that day, I let curiosity get the better of me. The resort wasn't exactly crowded, and I was craving something different, something challenging. I'd overheard a few locals talking about some off-map trails, runs that weren't officially marked but were legendary for their difficulty. After a quick check of the weather and a glance around to make sure no staff were watching, I slipped past the boundary signs and headed into the trees. At first, it was incredible. The snow was untouched, pristine, and the silence was almost spiritual. Then I noticed the tracks. 2 snowboarders had been here recently. I remember thinking how odd it was since I hadn't seen anyone else sneaking into this area. The tracks zigzagged wildly, deeper into the forest, and against my better judgment, I followed them. Not because I wanted company, but because the terrain they'd taken looked insane. Narrow passes, sharp drops, sheer cliffs. My adrenaline was pumping just imagining the run. But as I got further in, the atmosphere changed. The sunlight barely broke through the trees anymore, and everything felt off. I paused to catch my breath, and that's when I heard them. Laughter, harsh and slurred, echoing through the stillness. 2 guys on snowboards appeared on the ridge above me, their movements erratic, like they'd been drinking, or worse. They spotted me instantly and shouted something I couldn't make out, but their tone was enough to make my stomach drop. At first, I tried to brush it off. People get rowdy on the slopes all the time, and I figured they'd just move on. But they didn't. Instead, they started making their way down toward me, carving aggressively in the snow. As they got closer, I could see their faces, flushed, eyes wild. One of them called out, "You lost? Or just stupid enough to come out here alone?" I didn't answer. Something about their energy was way off, like they weren't just drunk, they were looking for trouble. The second guy grinned, but it wasn't friendly. "This isn't your kind of trail, pal," he slurred, stopping a few feet from me. "You better head back before you get hurt." I told them I was just passing through and started to move down the slope, hoping they'd let it go. That's when one of them reached out with his snowboard and knocked into my skis, throwing me off balance. "Hey!" I snapped, trying to steady myself, but my voice sounded shaky. They laughed, a mean, hollow sound that echoed in the cold. "We're just having fun," the first guy said, but the way he blocked my path told me otherwise. My heart started pounding, and every instinct screamed at me to get out of there. I tried to sidestep around them, but they weren't having it. "Where do you think you're going?" the second guy taunted. And then, just like that, they both took off downhill, carving sharp turns that kicked up snow, waiting for me to follow. I hesitated for a split second, but staying there wasn't an option. They'd cut down the only clear path, forcing me to follow if I wanted to get out of the trees. My legs moved before my brain could catch up, and I pushed off, chasing the narrow line of snow between the trees. At first, they stayed ahead of me, shouting and laughing, but then one of them slowed down just enough to cut across my path, spraying a cloud of powder in my face. I veered sharply to avoid him, my heart hammering as my skis skidded over a patch of ice. My balance wavered, and for a moment, I thought I was going to go down. Behind me, I heard the other guy yell, "Faster, or you're not gonna make it." They weren't just messing around anymore. They were hunting me. Every instinct I had screamed to turn back, but I couldn't. The trees were too dense, and their tracks were the only way out. I leaned into the turns, trying to stay focused, but the trail was getting steeper and narrower. One wrong move, and I'd end up in a ravine. Ahead, the guy in front glanced back, his expression shifting from amusement to something darker. "Think you're quick," he shouted, then cut a hard left, disappearing into the trees. His buddy followed, but not before throwing something, maybe a rock, maybe a chunk of ice, right into my path. It smacked into the snow, spraying up chunks, and I barely managed to swerve around it. My stomach dropped as I realized this wasn't just a game to them anymore. I had no choice but to keep going. The slope was getting more dangerous, with sheer drops on one side and trees pressing in on the other. My thighs burned as I pushed harder, trying to keep control while my mind raced for a plan. The snowboarders were just ahead, weaving erratically but clearly waiting for me to catch up. One of them glanced back and yelled, "What's the matter? Can't keep up." His words echoed in the hollow quiet, mocking me. I didn't respond. My focus was locked on staying upright and avoiding the jagged rocks starting to jut out of the snow. Every twist and turn felt like a trap, like they were leading me into something worse. Then it happened. The guy in front suddenly veered off to the right, plunging into a gap between the trees. His friend slowed just enough to glance back at me before following. I hesitated. Whatever was ahead couldn't be good, but there was no time to think. Behind me, the wind carried the faint sound of cracking branches, like something, or someone, was coming down the mountain after us. I turned and saw nothing but the blur of snow-covered trees, yet the feeling that I wasn't alone grew stronger. It was suffocating, like the air itself was closing in. I clenched my jaw and followed their tracks, praying this wasn't some kind of setup. As I entered the gap in the trees, I realized how reckless I'd been. The terrain was barely navigable, with uneven snow and hidden roots jutting out like traps. The snowboarders were ahead, moving slower now, but it didn't feel like a reprieve. It felt like they were waiting for me. My chest tightened as the trail narrowed into what looked like a dead end, a sharp drop-off into a gully surrounded by steep cliffs. They stopped just before the edge, one of them sitting casually on his board while the other leaned on his knees. Grinning like this was the punchline to some cruel joke. "You got guts," one of them called out as I slowed to a stop a few feet away, my skis skidding against the icy surface. "But this is where your run ends." I glanced behind me, half expecting to see someone, or something, chasing us. Nothing. Just the wind howling through the trees. "You can turn around," the guy continued, his tone mocking. "But good luck getting back alive." His friend laughed, tossing a beer can into the gully. It clattered against the rocks, the sound carrying far too long in the silence. My pulse thundered in my ears as I weighed my options. There weren't many. They had the upper hand here, both literally and figuratively. But then I noticed something. Movement in the trees just beyond them. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but enough to make the hairs on my neck stand up. Whatever was out there, I wasn't the only one who'd seen it. The grins on their faces faded, replaced by something I hadn't seen yet: fear. The change in their expressions was instant. The guy who'd been laughing froze mid-smirk, his eyes locked on the tree line behind me. "What the hell is that?" he muttered, his voice low, almost like he didn't want to be heard. I turned instinctively, but there was nothing there, just the swaying shadows of trees in the wind. "Stop messing around," his buddy snapped, but his voice wavered. "You're freaking me out." The tension between them was palpable now, and for a second, I thought I might be able to use it to my advantage. But then it hit me, a sound, faint at first, like snow crunching underfoot. It was coming closer. Whatever it was, it wasn't running or stumbling. It moved with purpose. The snowboarders exchanged a glance, and in that moment, their cocky facade crumbled. "We need to get out of here," one of them said, already strapping his board back on. His hands were shaking. The other guy hesitated, glancing back at me, and for a brief moment, I thought he was going to apologize, or warn me. But then he turned and bolted, following his friend. I didn't wait to see what they'd seen. My instincts kicked in, and I pushed off the edge, skiing toward the gully. The slope was steep, almost vertical, but I didn't care. Staying up there wasn't an option. The sound was louder now, crashing through the trees like something far too big to be human. As I carved my way down, a scream tore through the air behind me, sharp and panicked. It wasn't mine. The scream sent a jolt of adrenaline through my entire body. I didn't dare look back. I couldn't. Whatever had caused it, I wanted no part of it. The gully was a nightmare to navigate, with jagged rocks and patches of ice that threatened to send me tumbling to my death. My legs burned as I pushed harder, every muscle straining to keep my balance. The sound of the scream lingered, echoing in the back of my mind, but I couldn't hear the snowboarders anymore. The wind howled, and for a moment, the only thing I could hear was the rush of my skis cutting through the snow. I thought I was alone, but then I saw it, a flash of movement ahead. It was one of the snowboarders, sprawled face down in the snow at the base of the gully. His board was shattered, pieces scattered around him. I slowed instinctively, unsure if he was alive or not, but then I saw the way his body twitched. He wasn't dead yet. I moved closer, my breath fogging in the freezing air. "Hey," I called out, my voice hoarse. He didn't respond, just kept clawing at the snow like he was trying to get away from something. My gut twisted as I realized he wasn't looking at me. His eyes were wide, fixed on the ridge above us. Slowly, I turned my head to follow his gaze, and that's when I saw it. Something massive, something wrong, standing in the shadows of the trees. I couldn't process what I was seeing. It was tall, easily over 7 feet, but hunched, its limbs impossibly long and angular, like it had been stretched beyond what was natural. Its head tilted slightly, almost curiously, as it watched us. My breath hitched, and I froze, every instinct screaming at me to move, but my body refused to cooperate. The snowboarder let out a choked sob, dragging himself through the snow, his movements frantic. The thing didn't move, not at first, but its presence was suffocating, like the air around it was heavier. Then it stepped forward, slow and deliberate, and I swear I felt the ground shudder beneath me. That was all it took to snap me out of my paralysis. I turned and pushed off with everything I had, tearing down the gully as fast as my skis could carry me. The trail was unforgiving, but I didn't care anymore. My only goal was to get as far away as possible. Behind me, I heard the snowboarder scream, a wet, gurgling sound that made my stomach churn. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The gully opened up into a wider slope, and I felt a flicker of hope. If I could just make it back to the resort, back to people, I'd be safe. But that hope was short-lived. The silence that followed the scream was worse than the sound itself. It wasn't just quiet, it was like the entire mountain had gone still. The silence pressed on me like a weight, making every sound I made feel deafening. The scrape of my skis, the ragged breaths tearing from my lungs. I didn't dare slow down. The open slope should have felt safer, but it didn't. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that it was still there, somewhere behind me, just out of sight. My mind raced, replaying the image of that thing in the trees. It didn't make sense. What was it? How could something like that even exist? But those questions didn't matter. Surviving did. I scanned the horizon, desperate for some sign of the resort, but all I saw was snow and trees stretching endlessly in every direction. And then I heard it again, the crunch of snow. This time, it was close. Too close. My legs almost gave out as I risked a glance over my shoulder. The ridge behind me was empty, but the shadows between the trees seemed to shift and ripple, like they were alive. I turned back just in time to avoid a fallen branch, my skis barely clearing it. Panic clawed at my throat. I couldn't keep this up much longer. My muscles burned, my lungs screamed for air, and the slope ahead was becoming more treacherous. But stopping wasn't an option. I pushed harder, focusing on each turn, every inch of ground that brought me closer to safety, if safety even existed anymore. The tree line broke suddenly, revealing a clearing ahead. Relief surged through me. This was familiar. I recognized the slope as part of the main resort, far off to the side but still reachable. I was almost there. The faint outline of a lift station came into view, the cables stretching upward like a lifeline. But as I pushed toward it, something stopped me dead in my tracks. A shadow moved across the clearing, fast and deliberate, cutting off the path. My heart felt like it stopped. It wasn't human. Too large, too fluid. It darted between the trees, blending in so seamlessly it was almost impossible to follow. I backed up instinctively, my skis crunching on the snow, and the sound felt deafening in the stillness. I scanned the clearing, my breath fogging the air as I tried to make sense of what I'd just seen. Then came a sound I'll never forget, a low, guttural growl, deep enough to rattle in my chest. My body reacted before my brain could. I veered hard to the left, aiming for a narrow path that led away from the lift station but back toward the resort base. It wasn't ideal, but it was the only option. As I fled, I swore I could feel it closing in, its presence like a shadow that clung to me no matter how far I went. I pushed down the narrow path, every turn feeling more precarious as my legs screamed in protest. The trees blurred past me, their trunks a chaotic maze I could barely navigate. My breathing was shallow and erratic, my thoughts a jumble of fear and desperation. I didn't know if I was faster than whatever was chasing me, but I didn't dare stop to find out. The slope steepened suddenly, forcing me to lean forward to keep my balance. My skis scraped over a patch of ice, and for a heart-stopping moment, I almost lost control. Behind me, the growl came again, closer this time. I didn't have time to think about what might happen if I fell. I just kept going, every instinct screaming at me to get off that mountain. Then, through the trees, I saw it, the edge of the resort base. It was so close I could make out the tops of buildings and the faint movement of people milling around the lodge. Relief surged through me like a drug. I let out a shaky breath, but it caught in my throat as the shadows around me seemed to close in. Whatever was following me wasn't giving up. I could feel it, an almost physical pressure, like the air itself was being dragged behind me. I leaned forward and pushed myself to the limit, my only goal to reach the safety of the lodge before it could catch me. The final stretch to the resort felt endless. My legs were barely holding up, and every breath burned in my chest, but the sight of people, actual people, gave me a shred of hope. I risked one last glance over my shoulder, and for a split second, I saw it. It had emerged from the shadows, towering and skeletal, its elongated limbs moving unnaturally fast. My blood ran cold as its head snapped toward me, its glowing predatory eyes locking onto mine. I don't think I screamed. I was too terrified to make a sound. I turned back toward the lodge and pushed harder, every nerve in my body begging me to hold on just a little longer. I shot out of the tree line and into the open, my skis carving deep grooves in the packed snow as I hurtled toward the lodge. A few people turned to look, confused by my speed and my wild expression. I stumbled to a stop, collapsing onto my knees in the snow, gasping for air. Someone ran over to help, but all I could do was point back at the trees, trying to warn them. When I finally managed to turn and look, the tree line was still. No movement, no sign of the creature, just the quiet hum of the resort. I wanted to believe I was safe, but even now, I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, waiting. I never went back to that mountain, and I don't think I ever will.